Hello, Jason. It's Wednesday, June 11th, and tomorrow is a really important day for citizens of Ontario. Because, as it happens, there's a provincial election going on, and this one, I have a feeling, is going to be a rather important one. At least, it'll be important for people our age because we're just trying to get started in our careers, and there are a lot of forces at work that dictate whether or not we can do that. So this is just a friendly rad bromance reminder. If you're of legal voting age and you live in Ontario, remember to get out and vote tomorrow. Our lives may depend on it. Really quick side note in case you're wondering, that thing on my neck is in fact a band-aid. Long story short, I picked at something that I shouldn't have picked at. Which is unfortunately a bad habit of mine, so that's why there's a band-aid on my neck, and I hope it's not too distracting. And now to the topic at hand. The main thing I want to talk to you about today is the issue of adaptation, specifically the adaptation of books into movies and vice versa. I think you'll agree that it seems that in this day and age, pretty much everything is an adaptation. We have big screen adaptations of small screen TV shows, we have the adaptation of classic literature into video games, pretty much everything is recycled. But one thing that we rarely recognize is that this has been going on for a really long time, especially as it relates to novels being adapted into films. In fact, since 1930, 34 of the Best Picture winners at the Oscars have been adaptations of novels, including movies like Slumdog Millionaire, The Shawshank Redemption, Forrest Gump, and The Silence of the Lambs. And even more interestingly, there are issues of adaptation that we don't ever consider at all. For example, Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet wasn't originally his story, he adapted it. The fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm? Those weren't their fairy tales either, they just picked them up and adapted them. And so we're stuck in this bizarre space where we find the best examples of stories aren't necessarily the original stories themselves. And what does that really mean for the reader, or the viewer if it's adapted into a movie? Side note, of the 27 books I've either already read or am currently reading this year, 14 have been adapted into movies. 2 of which were adapted from movies, those being the Shakespearean Star Wars ones, and 6 of them are biographies, which had no real chance of being adapted. Which, if you do the math, means there's a grand total of 5 books out there that could be adapted that haven't been, out of 27. Now, what can we really say about adaptation? What does it mean? What makes something a good adaptation or a bad adaptation? I mean, we always hear it when we come out of a movie saying, oh, that was too far from the book, or that didn't add anything to the book. And to a degree, you're always going to have people who aren't satisfied with an adaptation because they're too loyal to the original product, or they don't really care about the original product to begin with. And so we have something like the Harry Potter series, where there are 2 camps, one that says the books were better, one that says the movies were better. But then we also have a third camp, and I think this is probably the largest one, which says that they're both good, we enjoyed them both, and it doesn't really matter that the movies had to leave stuff out or change stuff. Unfortunately, I'm not part of that third camp. I'm part of the camp that says that the books were definitely better, and I have my reasons for that. But I will say that my favorite 2 movies from the Harry Potter movie series were the first 2, because they were the ones that actually went out and made things happen instead of just using green screen. And while I'm on the subject, in their 3rd year, it seems that the children at Hogwarts had absolutely no dress code whatsoever. They just started wearing trendy clothes, and that bothers me. But anyway, back on topic. What makes a good adaptation? Well, I have a few ideas for my own personal opinion on what makes a good adaptation. And it has to do with the motive behind the adaptation in the first place. If you're just taking something that has made money and trying to make more money off of it by putting it in another form, then I'm not necessarily going to like what you're doing. For example, whenever we see these low-budget, made-for-TV versions of Stephen King's works, all we see is the word Stephen King plastered all over the front because people know that associating the product with his name is going to make viewership pretty high. But more often than not, they take the easy path towards making as much money as possible without really caring about the story or doing any effective storytelling through it. If an important scene in the novel is too cumbersome for them to actually record in person, then they just exclude it or change it, and that really bothers me. And quite frankly, I could go on and on and on about the adaptations I've seen of novels that haven't really impressed me, but I'm more interested in focusing on the ones that have. And I think that talking about 2001: A Space Odyssey again is a great way to start, because both the novel and the screenplay were written at the same time, and they offer very different products in the end. My biggest complaint about the movie was that, having read the book, I know that there's so much more going on behind the scenes that you just can't effectively show through filmmaking. And so what you end up with is a movie that's just a slightly less interesting version of the book, which is something that happens a lot with adaptations. But then we have movies like, quite frankly, one of my favorite movies of all time, The Godfather. In case you didn't know, The Godfather was a novel first, and it was a really interesting, though tedious, novel to read. In fact, I read it while I lived in Italy, and I liked it, but it wasn't really something that caught my attention very often. By contrast, the movie was able to do things that the book just couldn't do because it's on paper. For example, you can't have pauses, long breaks where nothing really happens in a book. You can try to do it by just having blank pages, something that people have actually tried, but what the reader will do is just flip through the pages. They won't sit there and wait a certain amount of time. And so, with all this talk, I'd like to know, what are some of your favorite And so, on film, The Godfather was able to be much more suspenseful than the book was, at least in my interpretation. Thus, we have an example of a story that was already really good being made even better by changing something or adding something to it, and that, I think, is the key to a successful adaptation. As another practical example, I want to bring up the thing that made me think of adaptations in the first place. There's a new trailer out for a new Assassin's Creed game, and if you listen to the song in the background, I think it's an extremely awesome adaptation of that song. Especially since the creators of the trailer were able to use the song in order to describe the setting and action of the video game that they're planning on making. It also probably helps that the game seems to take place in one of my favorite times and places of the entire world, the French Revolution. So I'll add a link to that down below, and I encourage you to watch it if you have some free time. It's only a couple of minutes long. And so, with all this talk, I'd like to know, what are some of your favorite adapted novels into films, or songs into other songs, or anything into anything? And now, on to Battleship. Your last shot was a miss. Poor Jason. And I'm going to go for a shot that's based primarily on my desire to maintain symmetry with the shots I've already hit, and attack H9.